The year is 1939, and a dark cloud is gathering over Europe. The echoes of the First World War have barely faded, and the world finds itself on the brink of a new conflict. It will be a war of ideologies, a war of survival, a war that will engulf the entire globe. This is World War II, the deadliest war in the history of mankind. Our story unfolds in Germany, where Hitler, the magnetic and ruthless leader of the Nazi Party, has just risen to the position of Chancellor. Fueled by his fanatical vision of Aryan supremacy and unyielding German nationalism, Hitler swiftly moves to tighten his grip on power, setting the stage for a nation on the brink of catastrophe. He remilitarized the Rhineland, defying the Treaty of Versailles, and began the systematic persecution of Jews, accusing them of being enemies of the state. As Hitler's aggressive foreign policy became evident, Europe started to take notice. Across the Channel in Britain, the royal family is still basking in the glory of their victory in the First World War. George VI, the new King of England, is determined to maintain the British Empire's global dominance. However, he has a problem. Britain's economy is in sharp decline, and its people are exhausted after years of fighting. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini has seized power and established a fascist dictatorship. Mussolini, who had fought in the First World War as a young man, was eager to emulate the perceived glory of ancient Rome by expanding Italian territory. He set his sights on Ethiopia, which after a brief but brutal campaign became an Italian colony. In the Pacific, Japan, under the military rule of Emperor Hirohito, is undergoing rapid modernization. Japan's new military leaders were eager to expand Japanese territory and influence, viewing China as the first step in achieving this goal. In 1937, the Japanese army marched into China, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. As the 1930s progressed, tensions grew. The uneasy peace that had settled over Europe after the First World War was shattered by a series of aggressive actions. On September 1, 1939, German troops crossed into Poland, marking the official start of the Second World War. 2 days later, Britain and France, bound by their obligations to defend Poland, declared war on Germany. The war in Europe began with Germany's Blitzkrieg or lightning war strategy, a combination of speed and overwhelming force. German air power, spearheaded by the iconic Luftwaffe, quickly gained control of the skies. This allowed German ground forces to advance rapidly, utilizing tanks and motorized infantry to penetrate deep into enemy territory. By the end of September, Poland had effectively ceased to exist. Large parts of it were occupied by Germany, while the remainder was divided between the Soviet Union and Finland. With Poland out of the way, Germany turned its attention to its next target, Denmark and Norway. The Norwegian campaign began on April 9, 1940, when German troops invaded the neutral country. Despite fierce resistance, Norway fell within 3 weeks. The Danish campaign was even shorter, lasting only 9 days before the entire country was under German control. But the real test of the war would come with the Battle of France. Germany launched a massive surprise attack through Belgium, swiftly advancing toward Paris. The British Expeditionary Force, along with the remnants of the Polish army, began a fighting retreat to the beaches of Dunkirk. Miraculously, they were saved from near annihilation by a massive civilian effort, ferrying them back to Britain. Though shaken, the British were now fully committed to the fight. They had just seen firsthand the terrifying capabilities of the German war machine. As the Battle of France raged on, the Germans, under the leadership of Field Marshal Hermann Goering, launched a massive air assault on Britain. Known as the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe aimed to destroy the Royal Air Force and gain air superiority. For 6 months, London skies were filled with dogfights between German and British planes. By October, the battle was effectively over. The RAF had won, thanks to their advanced radar system and the courage of their pilots. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the war between Germany and the Soviet Union was reaching a fever pitch. After violating prior agreements, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The initial German advance was swift. Cities like Kiev and Leningrad were quickly captured. But as winter approached, the tides turned. The vast distances and the unforgiving Russian weather slowed the German advance. Moreover, the Red Army, bolstered by the introduction of the winter warfare tactic, began to inflict heavy casualties on the Germans. The battle between these two titans would be one of the longest and bloodiest in the history of warfare. As the war in Europe intensified, the conflict in Asia was also heating up. Japan's aggressive expansionism had brought them into conflict with the Western powers. After the fall of France, Japan, sensing an opportunity, occupied French Indochina. This move, coupled with Japan's continued aggression in China, led to economic sanctions by the United States, Britain, and their allies. Japan, heavily reliant on imported resources, found itself in a precarious position. With the U.S. embargo on oil, Japan decided to gamble. They would capture resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Their first target, the British and Dutch East Indies. On December 8, 1941, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack caught the U.S. fleet off guard, sinking or damaging numerous ships and killing over 2,000 Americans. The next day, Japan declared war on the United States, officially bringing America into the Second World War. In response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, American and Canadian forces launched a series of attacks against Japanese positions in the Pacific. One of the most notable early engagements was the Battle of Midway. The battle was a decisive American victory, crippling Japan's naval power and turning the tide in the Pacific. But perhaps the most infamous event of the Pacific War came on August 6, 1945, when the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The devastation caused by these bombs was unprecedented. Over 100,000 people were killed instantly, and entire cities were reduced to ashes. Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced his nation's surrender on September 2, 1945. Marking the official end of the Second World War, the war in Europe had taken a brutal turn. Germany, pushed to the brink, had adopted a scorched earth policy, leaving vast areas of Europe in ruins. The Allies, nearing the end of their journey, had one final and monumental task before them, crossing the Rhine River and entering Germany. The operation was fraught with challenges. The Germans, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, had fortified the area around the Rhine extensively. But on March 24, 1945, American troops crossed the river at several points, opening a new front in the war. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, Hitler's fate began to seal. On April 1945, as the Soviet troops closed in, Hitler took his own life in his underground bunker in Berlin. With Hitler dead, the German High Command quickly surrendered. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered to the Allies, marking the end of the war in Europe. But the joy of victory was short-lived. The horrors of what had transpired during the war were now coming to light. Concentration camps were liberated, revealing the full extent of the Nazis' atrocities. Millions of Jews, along with other persecuted groups, had been systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. The world was left reeling at the revelation of such brutality. In the aftermath of the war, the Allies met at a series of conferences to discuss the future of Europe. The most significant of these was the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. At Potsdam, the three victorious powers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, outlined plans for the occupation of Germany and the general framework for post-war Europe. In the Asia-Pacific region, the end of the war saw the region devastated and millions dead. The region's infrastructure was crippled and economies were in sharp decline. The focus now shifted to the difficult task of rebuilding. The United States, seeing an opportunity, implemented the Marshall Plan, providing aid to war-torn European countries. This move was a strategic one, aiming to prevent the spread of communism. However, the legacy of the war was not confined to the immediate aftermath. It profoundly shaped the geopolitical landscape of the late 20th century. The emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers triggered the start of the Cold War. This new era of geopolitical tension would define the next half-century. World War II was a war like no other. It was a war that pushed humanity to its limits, testing our capacity for both great achievements and terrible atrocities. It was a war that changed the world, leaving an indelible mark on every nation and individual it touched. As we reflect on this monumental conflict, let us remember not only the bravery and sacrifice of those who fought, but also the lessons we must carry forward to ensure such horrors never repeat themselves.